One of the most disaster-stricken countries in the world is Indonesia. 140 million people live on the 13,000 islands, often under difficult conditions, so don't let these beautiful pictures fool you. During a 3-year period, a total of 572 natural disasters struck the country, principally earthquakes and floods. That is the grim background to a 5-year collaboration project between the Red Cross in Indonesia and in Sweden. Preventive disaster preparedness. That means that aid is available on the spot before disaster strikes, instead of acting as a fire brigade after the event. The project has cost $2 million in money from CEDA and the Red Cross. Now it is complete. There are 23 emergency centres existing around the country today. The core of each centre consists of people who are trained to plan, lead and manage stores and rescue services, together with thousands of voluntary Red Cross members. Their foremost facility is the disaster store. Disaster preparedness is a result of Swedish initiative and looks like being an important part of international aid in the future, a qualified aid to self-help. A Swedish consultant and advisor to the project is Asbjörn Olsson, the Red Cross delegate. Jan Birgersson from the Red Cross in Sweden asks Asbjörn Olsson whether the disaster preparedness program has meant anything to the ordinary man in Indonesia, as it is always the ordinary man who is affected most in a disaster. Mr. Olsson says that the program has meant a great deal to the ordinary man. It is the people out in the disaster areas who wait for the Red Cross to come, and they always do come with the initial relief. Jan Birgersson asks in what way the Red Cross helps. Asbjörn Olsson explains that in every disaster store there are supplies to meet every eventuality. Most important is a tent where doctors can examine injured victims or for the distribution of clothing. Altogether it's basic food, clothing and shelter. A disaster store contains equipment for $50,000, especially tested for effective disaster aid. It contains, among other things, 60 first aid cases, sewn incidentally by the Indonesian army. Medical supplies estimated to suffice for 10,000 people. Bottled gas for field hospitals and field kitchens, and many different sorts of vitamin preparations. The 6 field hospitals need dressing materials and other equipment. And the bundles of cloth are to be used to sew clothes for 25,000 people. It contains food also. 3 tons of powdered milk, together with pots and saucepans for 9 field kitchens. There are 5 old-type pedal sewing machines, which the volunteer workers use when they sew clothes for people who have lost everything in a disaster. In cases of severe disaster, electricity is out of the question, so there are 8 generators to cover the energy requirements. Transportation problems are considerable, as there is a lot of material which has to be taken out to the disaster areas. In cases of flooding, collapsible motorboats can be used for transportation needs, and for transport on land, each store has a truck and a car at its disposal. Seen here with Mr. Dadan Sukarna, who is responsible for the work on Western Java. Mr. Dadan is telling Jan Birgersson that the disaster preparedness program means an enormous amount, not only to those who receive aid, but to the entire community. Each store has 6 large tents. It is important that they can be erected quickly to provide working bases for medical treatment, and also to provide shelter when serving food prepared in the field kitchens. When a natural disaster occurs in areas which are difficult to reach, the victims may have to rely on the disaster resources of the Red Cross for a long time before the resources of the community can take over. Disaster work is arranged in Indonesia so that the Red Cross takes the initial responsibility with regard to medical treatment, clothing and food until the community takes over. Disaster strikes without warning, so it is vital always to be prepared for operations. Education and training are therefore very important items on the programme, including exercises which are as realistic as possible to improve capabilities. It can often be a question of carrying injured by stretcher over very difficult terrain, down through steep mountain ravines and over rushing torrents. Getting a stretcher down a precipice can be tough work and a giddy experience, not least for the victim in the exercise. Floods are common disasters in Indonesia. Some years ago, a third of the city of Semarang, with its 1 million inhabitants, was under almost 2 meters of water. The specially constructed boats of the Disaster Preparedness Programme do a great deal of good work, both in connection with life-saving in the rivers and during more long-term disaster work in times of flood or tidal wave. Well-trained disaster teams assure that flood victims receive the best possible attention. Other big disasters are caused by fire. A whole village or a city block can be reduced to smouldering debris in a single sweeping wall of flame, leaving the inhabitants completely destitute. The disaster organization of the Red Cross must provide them with the necessities of life. These food baskets being packed in the Red Cross building in Semarang are to be distributed to those in distress in a fire-ravaged suburb. Distribution is carried out centrally in the fire-stricken block, and all who receive aid are carefully registered by the distributors. The distribution of food can go on for a long time before orderly conditions can be arranged for the homeless. Narrow, winding mountain roads on Java, often with dense traffic, result in many accidents. The Red Cross is responsible for the ambulance service on Java. The ambulance stations are strategically sited along these roads where the traffic is thickest. The ambulances have technically advanced equipment and well-trained personnel so that treatment can be commenced at the scene of the accident. In order to improve first aid facilities, the ambulance service needs to be further reinforced. A big sub-project to the disaster preparedness program concerns equipping 25 new ambulance stations by 1985. Each new ambulance station costs $15,000. One hospital which has to receive many traffic accident victims is the Red Cross hospital in Bogor. This is especially so at weekends when the residents of Jakarta go off for trips in the mountain areas of Java. The hospital has looked more or less the same since 1930. The outpatients department is overcrowded, and the 300 or so beds are always occupied. In order to cope with traffic accident cases at the weekends, 20 patients have to be discharged every Friday, whether they are fit or not. The hospital in Bogor is the only one for a population of 2 million. That means some 12,000 operations each year using operating equipment that Dutch military doctors used during the Second World War, and which was later donated to Bogor. A rather unusual medical care problem is the difficulty in getting some of the patients to go to the hospital. They prefer to go to the medicine men in the villages. The witch doctors have great influence, and when the patient eventually goes to the hospital, it is often too late. As in many other parts of the world, it is the Red Cross which has the overall responsibility for blood supply in Indonesia. That means that blood donors must be recruited. They get no payment for their blood, but are rewarded with a simple meal, service badges, diplomas and medals. Considerable laboratory work is required to process and store the blood, which later on is distributed to hospitals all around this large island world. This operation is to be expanded as well by 1985. By establishing 41 new blood supply centres. Initially, 10 hospitals are to be reinforced with regard to blood supply, and later blood supply centres will be set up gradually at another 30-odd hospitals. Each blood centre will cost $17,000. Training is extensive. There are many different phases of disaster work which one must have command of within the scope of the programme. One must be able to construct stretchers, take care of injured, give first aid, dress wounds and many other things. Preparing food also requires training. One cannot feed thousands in difficult circumstances of disaster without careful preparation and equipment which is adapted to primitive conditions. The youth of Indonesia is very active in aid work, and a great number of youngsters are trained. However, money is needed for these activities, so they make and sell various things. Collaboration between Indonesia and Sweden has resulted in another sub-project concerning training. In all, 25 courses are planned for coming years, covering amongst other subjects, disaster preparedness, blood supply and command operations. Now disaster preparedness work moves over to another Asian culture, Burma, which for the last decade or so has been more or less closed to the outside world. The cooperation project between the Red Cross in Burma and in Sweden involves an investment of $1.5 million, and also here the keystones of the project are the setting up of disaster stores and the training of emergency workers. The training side of the project was put into effect quickly and efficiently. Today, the 314 administrative districts of Burma will each soon have a corps of well-trained instructors who in their turn will train assistants. One can say that they act as a combination of district nurse and public health inspector. The list of disasters in Burma can be very long. On average, the Red Cross Fire Brigade is called out 275 times a year. The location of Burma in a troubled corner of the world, with many different ideologies adjacent to it, results in a politically unstable situation. Attacks over the borders are a normal occurrence, and infiltrators bring about disorder in the community. Exercises in retrieving wounded under fire are an important phase of training. Exercises are carried out as realistically as possible with rifle fire whining over the heads of the stretcher bearers. Many of the attacks occur against undefended villages in the border zones, and rescuing injured from buildings is a normal task for the Red Cross. Severe natural disasters are a part of everyday life for the Burmese. During the rains there are floods in many areas, and during the dry season the levels in the wells and watercourses drop, so that one must then distribute water to the people in the drought areas. Every morning ox carts with water barrels fetch the valuable drops up from the Irrawaddy River. Then they set off on a sales trip round the villages where the water fetches a high price from the poor villagers. A bucket can cost as much as a day's wage. The inhabitants of many villages outside the royal city of Pagan, however, get their water through the Red Cross. Around 60,000 people are covered in the distribution, and here the 500 villagers of Poa Saw are getting water from a tank truck. The village of Poa Saw had its heyday 900 years ago, when the sovereign got his queen from there. But today it has difficulty in keeping drought and famine at bay. Those villagers who are either too old or too weak to fetch their water rations themselves have it carried to them. It's a joyous moment when the water pours into the clay jars and pots which have been standing bone dry. The villain of the piece in the drama of Burmese disasters is the terror of fire. Violent fires lay whole villages to waste. The Red Cross does the clearing up and helps the victims. Apart from border attacks, drought and fire, and a little speciality, plagues of rats, when hungry and aggressive creatures force people to flee head over heels from their villages, the disaster statistics also include tropical storms and cyclones. This village outside Pagan, right on the bank of the Irrawaddy, was struck by a cyclone which blew over the fragile houses. Until they are rebuilt, the government has entrusted the Red Cross with the task of administering to the villagers' needs. First of all, it is a question of getting a roof over the heads of the victims as soon as possible. Soon the collapsed houses will be rebuilt so that they will resemble this one, which is already finished. At the edge of the village, a welfare centre has been arranged. Food and medicines are handed out there, and every day a long queue winds past the food distributors who give each family powdered milk, flour and anything else required. Fruit and vegetables are easier to come by. Vitamins and medicines are also available to those who have got a requisition slip from the Red Cross personnel and representatives of the Ministry of Public Health. Something that one is very particular with is the control over conditions of hygiene, as an epidemic in a disaster-ravaged village would have devastating consequences. The Red Cross has many rescue service duties in Burma, and the ambulance service is a part of that duty. In the capital city, Rangoon, the ambulance station is situated on a crowded side street next to the Red Cross head office. One of the sub-projects in the disaster preparedness program covers the acquisition of 6 new ambulances during a period of 3 years. Already today, ambulances donated from Sweden drive through the swarming traffic of Rangoon with howling sirens to one or other of the city's hospitals. The need for waterborne transportation in cases of accident or illness is also great, so rescue boats are included in the program. They are manned by well-trained rescue crews. Boats are often the only way to get to hospital, as bridges over the wide rivers of Burma are few and far between. A not unusual journey for a patient from a remote village might take the following form. First by stretcher through the mountains, then by boat over the river, by ambulance to the airstrip, by plane to the nearest town with a hospital, and finally the last bit by ambulance. The alternative is to go without treatment. The material basis in the disaster preparedness program is, in Burma as in Indonesia, a number of stores. This is a central store in Rangoon which receives, among other things, second-hand clothing from Sweden. And there are stores in Mandalay, Kalemayo, Akyab and Tavoy. The store in Mandalay is now built and will now be filled like the other stores eventually with clothes for 20,000 people, 5 tons of powdered milk, medicines, hygiene materials and transportation equipment, together with a portable field hospital for 1,000 patients. By 1982 the project will be entirely complete, with stores and fully trained people spread around Burma. Then the disasters which are known to come with terrifying regularity won't need to strike so hard as previously. To have aid on the spot before disasters strike is many times more effective than to come along with help afterwards.